Begin the Gemara today towards the bottom of Daf Tezayin Amud Beis, where it says Rabbe Bar Chana. About 6 or 7 lines up from the bottom of the page. So this Gemara continues a discussion that we had before over here, 2 versions about this, whether when two shluchim deliver a get from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, so B'chlal, Chachamim instituted that they must testify that the get is kosher. B'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. The question is, does that takana apply even when 2 shluchim deliver the get? Now simply that shaila is dependent on the machlokes of Rabba and Rava. What's the purpose of testifying about this get? Is it for the fact that we should know that it was written Lishma? Then it doesn't make a difference if it's 1 or 2 Eidim. Or is it to verify the signatures? If it's about verifying the signatures, so then we say that you have 2 shluchim right over here, they can verify the signatures, they don't have to testify anything else. Or the Gemara before said that even according to Rabba, because it's Achar Shalomdu, now everybody knows the halacha of Lishma, and it's only a gzeira. It's a gzeira that things may revert back to the way it was. So if it's 2 shluchim that are bringing a get, since it's loy shchicha, it's uncommon for 2 shluchim to deliver a get, did Chachamim apply this gzeira even by 2 shluchim, which is not common? That was the way the Gemara described this before. So here, the next amud of the Gemara will be a continuation of that discussion. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Bachana cholash, Rabbi Bar Bachana got sick. So all legabei Rav Yehuda v'Rabbe, Rav Yehuda and Rabbe went to him l'shiyuli bei, to go to be mevakeh chayla, to see, to ask him, to inquire how he's doing. Bo minei, so when they were by him, so they discussed a Torah subject, and they asked him the shaila of our sugya. Shnayim sheviu get me Medinas Hayam, 2 shluchim delivering a get from Medinas Hayam. Tzrichen sheyaimru b'faneinu nichtav b'faneinu nechtam. Do they have to testify that it was written and signed in front of them? Or ain't tzrichen, or they do not. Amar lahem. So Rabbi Bar Bachana answered, ain't tzrichen. They don't have to testify about anything. And he added the following svara, which the Gemara already brought before in Daf Hey. Ma ilu yaimru b'faneinu girsha. If these 2 shluchim would come and say that in front of us this woman was divorced, the get was given to her in front of in our presence, miloi mehemni, would they not be believed? So if they could say that, so therefore there's no issue with this get at all. They can give the get and they're believed, and they don't have to testify about anything else. So this is sort of a different svara, a little bit different svara than I mentioned before regarding why 2 shluchim don't have to say anything. They can come and testify about the divorce themselves. There's no additional requirement for them to verify anything. Adahachi, while they were there, we're having this conversation. Asa hahu chabara. So this chabara came. Chabara, Rashi says, is one of the Persian goyim. The Yidden then are in Bavel, and the Persians are there. They're the ones that were the government. And there was a gzeira in that time that on a day of a holiday, they can't have any candles lit. Besides, in their houses of worship, you can't have any candle lit anywhere. So they had candles lit there, and they were having this discussion. So this chabara came, shakla l'shraget mekamayu, and he took away the candle from in front of them. Had no light. So this was a gzeira in that time period, which was very difficult to be able to do anything without any light. But not they weren't able to learn and so on. So Amar Rabbi Bar Bachana said, Rachmana, Eibishter, Oy betulach, either we should be in your shadow, that Eibishter should protect us, Oy betula de bar Esav, or at least we should be in the shadow of the descendants of Esav, which are the Romans. He was saying that it's easier to be in Galus by the Romans. The decree of the Romans aren't as bad as the decrees over here in Bavel that the Persians made upon us. That's what Rabbi Bar Bachana said. So the Gemara asks on this, Lememre, shall we say, that the Galus of the Romans, the Gzeiris and the Galus of the Romans is easier to deal with than the Gzeira of the Persians that are in Bavel. But Vatani, we learned in the Braisa the opposite. Vatani Rabchia said, Mai dechsev, what's the meaning of the pasuk where it says, Elakim haven darka. The Eibishter understood the ways of Torah and the ones that learn Torah. And V'hu yadas makaima. And the Eibishter knows its place. What does this mean? Yidei HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Yisrael, the Eibishter knows regarding Yidden, she'ein yechayel nekabel gzeiras reimim. They will not be able to handle the decrees of the Romans. And therefore, Amad v'higla isam leBavel. So where does the Eibishter send Yidden into exile? Into a place like Bavel. There were also gzeiras in Bavel, but the gzeiras of Bavel, of the Babylonians or the Persians there, are not as harsh as the gzeira of the Romans. So how can we say that Rabbi Bar Bachana was saying that it's better to be in Galus by the Romans than to be in Bavel by the Persians? It's the Gemara, there are different time periods. Loi kashi, it's not a question. Ha mekamed denesi chabad Bavel. This brayser of Chia darshan from the pasuk, that's speaking about when Yidden were in Bavel and the Babylonians were the ones that were ruling there before the Persians came. Rashi says when the Yidden came first to Bavel, who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash? So you had Nebuchadnezzar, which was a king from Bavel. Then following him, Rashi brings it was Evel Meredech and then Belshazzar. So in that time period, Yidden had it easier in Bavel, and therefore the pasuk says, "Lekim Haven Darka." The Eibishter finds a place for the Yidden that they are going to be under this government, but still it'll be easier for them. But then, but then after the Persians came and took over the kingdom, Ashir says that began from Kairish and further on when he took over the kingdom. So then the Persians were the ones that were ruling in Bavel. Then things became more difficult, and that's when Rabbi Bar Bar Chana was wishing that they would be under the Romans. That's Rashi's pshat in this Gemara. Okay, going back now to the very last case of the Mishnah in the beginning of the Perek, which will continue this discussion regarding two shluchim delivering a get. So the Mishnah said, so one is saying about this get brought here from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael that it was written in front of him. Shnayim Oimrim, and two are testifying b'feneinu nechtam, that this get was signed in front of us. So the Mishnah said, kosher. In such a case, this testimony is accepted and the get is kosher. Omer Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, why is it kosher? Don't you have to testify together, b'fanei nichtav and b'fanei nechtam? So Rabbi Yechanan explained, Lo yishanu el shahaget yotze mitachas yad eid ksiva. The one that's testifying that the get was written in front of him, he is the shliach, and he's saying that it was written in front of him. So true, he's not testifying that the get was signed in front of him, but there are two that are testifying about the signature. So therefore, the naso kishnayim alzeh or kishnayim alzeh. So now it's as if you have two Eidim testifying for the writing of the get and two Eidim testifying for the signing of the get, because the shliach, that's one shliach, testifying about the writing of the get, but the words of a shliach are trusted like two. That's the part of the takana that Chazal said we had in the beginning of the Masechta, that we trust one like two. He's very medayik, and we trust him like two. And then the other two that are testifying about the signatures, they're not the shluchim, but they're two. So now you have two for the signatures and two for the writing of the get as well. So therefore it's perfect. But if the shluchim are the ones that are testifying for the signatures of the get, and then that one individual that's testifying about the writing of the get is not a shliach, so he's just counted as one person, one aid on the writing of the get, so then pasul. Then the get will be pasul. You only have one aid for the writing of the get. Says the Gemara, what do we see from this? Alme, from this I see, Kasava, Rabbi Yechanan's opinion is, Shnayim sheviu get me Medina Sayyam. Even if two shluchim are delivering a get from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael, tzrichim sheyomru b'faneinu nichtav b'faneinu nechtam. They still have to testify that the get was written and signed in front of them. And that's why he's saying that there'll be a difference here, whether the two shluchim are saying b'faneinu nechtam, that is, or it's the one shliach that's saying b'fanei nichtav, because you still need that testimony even if it's shluchim. So Ravasi now says to him, going back to the previous cases of the Mishnah, and which was already really discussed on the previous Amud. So if so, what did it say earlier in the Mishnah? Reisha diktani. In the Reisha of the Mishnah where it says, Shnayim oimrim b'faneinu nichtav. Two Eidim are saying that the get was written in front of them. Ve'echad oimrim b'faneinu nichtav. And one says that it was signed in front of them. So the Tanakama there says it's pasul. And Rabbi Yehuda machsher. Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So according to your interpretation, even if there are two shluchim that are delivering the get should still be pasul, because you're saying that even two do have to testify b'fanei nichtav b'fanei nechtam. Amalei. So Rav Ami answered, yeah, you're right. This is true. This is Rabbi Yechanan's opinion. Even two that deliver a get, if they don't give the proper testimony for the kashrus of the get, it'll be pasul. This is one version of the story, or what happened actually in one time. But now, Zimnin, there was another time, Ashkechei, so Rab Ami, or Rab Asi rather, found Rab Ami, the Yosef Ka'amar, that he was sitting and was saying in the name of Rabbi Yechanan, basically the exact opposite. Going back to the case of the Mishnah, where one is saying, B'fanei nichtav, and two are testifying b'fanei nechtam. So he said about the Mishnah that even if the get was delivered by the two shluchim and they are testifying about the edim of the signatures, and you have just one that's testifying about the writing of the get. And that one is not a shliach. So his testimony is just of 1/8. Nevertheless, kosher. It'll still be kosher even though you don't have a proper testimony for the writing of the get. So now the Gemara says, based on this, Alma, why would it be kosher? You don't have a proper testimony for the ksiva of the get. Alma Kisava, so from this I see that he holds Shnaim Shaviu Get Me Medina Sayam. Once you have two shluchim that are delivering their get, you really don't have to testify anything. So the fact that you don't have a proper edus on the ksiva doesn't matter. You don't need any of this testimony at all. Amalei Ravasi, so then again the Gemara explains according to this the previous case in the Mishnah as well. So Ravasi said to Ravami, so Elamayata, so based on this, Reisha Diktani, the previous case of the Mishnah where it says that Shnai Maimer B'Faneinu Nichtav, that it's two that say that it was written in front of them, Ve'echadayim B'Fanei Nechtam, and one says that it was signed in front of them, Puzzle. So the Tanakama says it would be Puzzle. Ve'Rab Yehuda Machshe, and Rab Yehuda says it would be kosher. Why would it be kosher? So Taime, the only reason why, there's an argument over here. So actually the Gemara is saying Taime on the Tanakama. Why would the Tanakama say it's Puzzle? Because the Eina Get Yitzim Mitachas Yidei Shnei. Because there are no two shluchim that deliver the get. Oh, get Yitzim Mitachas Yidei Shneim. But if it was two shluchim that delivered the get, Machshiri Rabbanan, then there would be no argument there. Even the Rabbanan would agree. That's what it comes out according to this, what he told him now. That when once two deliver the get, there's no problem at all. But Amalei, Rabasi tells Rabami, again, first he responds to him and says, you're right. Amalei in, yes, this is true. If two deliver the get, there's no problem. But now, Rav Asi asked Rav Ami, but there was another time that I discussed this with you, and you told me the opposite in the name of Rabbi Yechanan. So what happened? Which one is, what's the halacha? Amalei, and this is the conclusion of this whole sugya about two delivering a get. So he told him this last version that you heard from me now, that if two deliver a get, they do not have to testify for the kashus of this get. That is the halacha. Yes, said he, shaloi timoit. This is like a nail or a peg that's like banged into the ground that cannot be botched from its place. This is the final halacha, this version that they do not have to testify b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta. And with this we close the sugya of b'fanei nichta, b'fanei nechta that we had in the beginning of the Masechta, and over here the last few blat. From here the Gemara moves on to a new subject. Okay, so the next Mishnah will discuss the halacha of zman. The fact that you have to write a date in a get. Minat Torah, you don't have to write a date in the get. You have to, Kosav La Sefer Krisis, you write to the nusach that you're divorcing her, but a date in a get, there's no such a thing Minat Torah. Chachamim instituted that you have to write a date in a get. So here, this Mishnah will tell us this halacha, and the Gemara will explain the reason for why Chachamim required a date in a get. Sagt der Heilige Mishnah, Nichtav Bayayim. The get was written by date. But v'nechtam b'yom, and it was also signed on that very same day. So a get that's written, until it's signed, the document is not a valid document at all. So the whole validity of the document is by the signature. So if it was written and signed on the same day, so you have the date that they wrote on it is the same when the get actually became a valid get, because it was signed on the very same day. Or the same thing balayla, v'nechtam balayla. It was written at night and then it was signed at night, so it becomes a valid document on the same date that it was written. Or another example where it's the same date that it was written, Balayla, the get was written at night, and V'nechtam B'yom, and it was signed the following day. So it's the same date, and the night and the day is the same day. So in all of these examples, kosher. So the get is kosher because it has a proper date on it. But however, B'yom, V'nechtam Balayla, you write the get by day, but it wasn't signed until the following night. So the get does not become a kosher get until the following night. But meanwhile, it has a date from the previous day when it was written. So puzzle. So because it has a date that's earlier when it actually became kosher, so it's puzzle, not the right date on it. Rab Shimon machsher. However, Rab Shimon says a get that has an earlier date will still be kosher. Shahoya Rab Shimon Omer. Rab Shimon used to say, Kol Gittin shenichtavu b'yom v'nechtu b'layla, all other documents, any money documents that are written by day and are signed at night, so it has an earlier date than the time that it actually became a valid document, psulim. All of those documents will be puzzle. Chutz mi Gittin noshin. When it comes to a get used for a divorce, over here the fact that it has an earlier date doesn't matter. Now the reason for this simply is when it comes, Rashi says all other Gittin, let's say a loan or sales. So over there, let's use the example of a loan. So if you're writing a date on a loan, it's very relevant to know from what time does the lender have the right to collect from your properties that you own. And if you sell off those properties from that time, from that date going forward, if it was sold after that date, when those properties became meshubed, there was a lien on those properties for the lender to collect from them. So if it was sold after that time period, the lender can come and confiscate those properties. But if you're going to write an earlier date on this document, so then you're going to come and confiscate those properties from the buyer from that earlier date when you didn't even borrow the money from that time period. So therefore, writing an earlier date gives them rights to confiscate shaloi Gittin from someone that bought a property. So therefore, by money matters, it's very important to have the right date, not an earlier date. But when it comes to a get is just a divorce. She's not collecting anything with this get. And the Rishonim actually add that even the ksubah that she collects, but the right of the isha to collect the ksubah begins from the time of marriage. The shibud on the karkois and the properties that the husband owns starts from the time of marriage. So the date of the get doesn't matter. So therefore, the Rav Shimon says there's no need to have the right date on a get. Okay, the Gemara will explain more, two understand, different versions to understand the machlekes here of the Tanakama and Rav Shimon. Let's see. But first,
does make a difference.
Again,
it's not need, it does make a difference.
You don't have to. It looks like from the Mishnah that it's saying that you don't need a date altogether, according to Rav Shimon. Well, we'll see more in the Gemara. But first, the Gemara will bring b'chlal the source. Why do you need a date and a get altogether? If you don't need a date on a get for collecting the ksuba money, so what is the date on a get b'chlal? So we learned the following machlekes. Why did Chachamim institute that a get should have a date on it? Rabbi Yechanan says, Mishum bas achaisai. It's because of a person's wife that may be his niece. That's the translation of the Gemara. Now, what does this mean? What this means is, what happens if a person's wife is his relative, and therefore he's close to her and he has rachmanis on her? Even in a case where she went and she had a relationship with someone else as an Eishes Ish while she's married to him. What happens if a woman has a relation with someone else as an Eishes Ish? She's chayiv misa, she's chayiv chenek. But now, this is a woman that's close to you, she's your relative, and you want to save her life. How are you going to save her life? Write a get, give her a get without a date, and then when Bezdin is going to say that she's chayiv misa for what she did, come to the get and bring the get and look, say she was divorced. When that happened, when this story happened, she was already divorced, and the get has no date on it, and he'll cover up for her to say that she was already single at that point. Okay, so now the Rishonim say that, or the Mefarshim say, that when the Gemara gives this example of Bas HaChaisai, it's just giving an example of a person's wife that's someone that he cares for and is very close to him and he's ready to cover up for her even after she does something like this. But it doesn't necessarily mean Dafka Bas HaChaisai. This could be in other cases as well, where a person wants to cover up for his wife that was Mizana and is Chayiv Misa, so then he could just use a get without a date to cover up for her. So you write the date on the get. So now we can't, usually in other places, this is known as Shami Yechape. Yechape means that he might cover up for her. So that's why you have to have a date on the get. Okay, so according to this reason, the main point is not to write a earlier date on the get to cover up for her. Shlokish Amar, Shlokish says, no, the reason for a date on a get is completely different. We're actually concerned that he may write a later date. Mishom Peiris. And the reason is because of Peiris, the fruits. Because during the time when a husband's married, so he has the nichsei melug. Nichsei melug are those properties that belong to his wife. But while he's married to her, the husband is the one that has the rights to use all the fruits, to sell them, to make business out of them. It doesn't only mean literally fruits from a property, but let's say his wife owns a home and it's a rental property. So who's the one that gets the income of the rental? The husband. That's the fruit sort of, what comes out of this property. So while they're married, he has the rights to use this for himself. So what's a husband going to do if he's divorcing his wife? He's going to write a later date on the get, and she's going to come to him and say, why are you still getting income from my properties? So he's going to say, take a look at the get. That the get says that we were still married at this point. And the truth is that he gave her the get earlier on. So he may write a later date in order to get continued use of his wife's properties. So therefore you have to write a get on a date on the get. Again, what did I just say before? I said that he's going to write a later date. The point of it is not that he's going to write a later date. No, that's not the problem. The Eidim Bezdin will not allow him to write a later date. But the problem is that if there's no date on the get, that's the issue. If there's no date on the get, so then he's going to say that I divorced you at a later time. So therefore you have to write a date, so we know exactly when it is that he owes her the money. If he took anything extra, he has to give her back. Says the Gemara, Reish Lakish, my time Aliyama Rabbi Yechanan. Why did Reish Lakish not say like Rabbi Yechanan's reasoning? Amalach, Reish Lakish will answer you because that's not something that's common. Znus lo shchicha. This story that Rabbi Yechanan says that the Chacham are concerned, a wife will be mizana and then he's going to try to cover up for her, that's very uncommon. Now, Taisus here does point out, it doesn't mean to say that the possibility of znus happening is not common, because the very first Mishnah in Ksubis that says that marriage should be on a Wednesday is related to a concern about znus. But this concern here about znus, that a husband will then go and cover up for his wife, that's not common enough for Chachamim to make a special takana to write a date on the get.
Wednesdays are less reason.
Regarding over there to have to have the bezdin available, that's the halacha of the first Mishnah in Ksubis. Okay, but Rabbi Yechanan, my time alama keresh lakish. Not Rabbi Yechanan. Why did he not say like the reasoning of Reish Lakish, that were concerned that the husband will claim that he divorced her at a later time? Because the answer is because he holds yesh lebal peiris at shas nesina, because the husband has the rights to collect his fruits from the properties that she owns till the time of the giving of the get. So therefore, how is it going to help to write a date on the get? You could write a date on the get from today till tomorrow, but there's nothing you can prove from there. Because the date on the get could be written whatever time it was, but you could end up giving the get much later. So the date of the get proves nothing. So therefore, that doesn't help you at all. There's no point in writing the date on the get for this purpose, so that now we can prove up until which point he was allowed to use the fruits. Anyways, the fruits is not related to the writing of the get. It's relating to when you give the get. That's Rashi's pshat in this Gemara here. Okay, there's a big arichas and taisus about this, but that's how Rashi learns its Gemara. Okay, now says the Gemara, coming back to our Mishnah. We had a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rab Shimon. According to Reish Lakish's explanation of what the point of writing a date on a get is, we could actually explain that Rab Shimon doesn't disagree with this entire concept here of writing a date on a get. But we can understand why Rab Shimon is saying that if you wrote the date on the get, and then it was signed the next night or maybe the next day, nevertheless, Rab Shimon holds the date that's written when on the writing of the get, that's perfect. And we can understand why Rab Shimon says so. So Rashi here explains that this is based on something the Gemara is going to actually say later, that according to Rab Shimon, the husband's rights to the fruits of his wife's property is only until when the get is written. Not until when the get is signed, and for sure not until when the get is given to her. And the reason is, Rashi says, the moment we see a husband writing a get, that means he sort of made that decision that he wants to divorce her, or at least he's considering it very, very strongly. From that point on, he loses the right to use any of the fruits of his wife's property. So therefore, Rab Shimon says, if you have the date written on the get by the time of the writing of the get, even though it was only signed later or was given later, that doesn't matter. The main thing is to know what the date was when the get was written, because it's only up until that point that he could collect the fruits of the properties of his wife. That's the reason for Rab Shimon, according to Reish Lakish. But according to Rabbi Yechanan, my time with Rab Shimon the machsher. Why does Rab Shimon say that you write a date on the get when it was being written, and then it's only signed until the next night, and it comes out that you have an earlier date on the get? It should still be a problem according to Rabbi Yechanan. What was the problem according to Rabbi Yechanan? That a person would want to cover up for his wife that was mizana. He would want to try to prove that she was single at that time. Says Rashi, isn't it possible that the znus happened on that very day? So he quickly goes and writes a get with the date of that day, and then it's not signed and it's not given to her until the evening, and then he says, look at the get, she was already single at this time. So isn't there still a problem that he may be covering up for her? Amalach Rabbi Yechanan, so Rabbi Yechanan answers, you're right, I'll leave it that Rab Shimon loy kamina. I have not said my explanation for the reason of the date of a get according to Rab Shimon. Ki kamina, I'll leave it at Rabbanan. My reason is according to the Rabbanan that say that you must have the date of the writing and the signature of the get in the same time. It can only go according to the Rabbanan. It doesn't fit with Rab Shimon's opinion. Okay, so now according to this, the Gemara turns around and says, so if so, Bishlam le Rabbi Yechanan. So now we understand, according to Rabbi Yechanan, Haina de'ikeh bein Rab Shimon le Rabbanan. We have now a perfect explanation. What's the argument between Rab Shimon and the Rabbanan? Rab Shimon say the point of writing a date is for us to know up until what point the husband can eat from the fruits of his wife's property. And Rab Shimon holds that up until what point is that? Only until when he decides to write a get. So therefore, if the signature of the get takes place later, it doesn't matter. So that's Rab Shimon. And the Rabbanan say, no, there's an additional concern, that he may want to cover up for his wife that was Mizana. And therefore you have to have the proper signature, you have to have the proper date, that is, for the time when the get was signed. So we have a good explanation for the argument here between the Rabbanan and Rab Shimon. But according to Rish Lakish, Ma'ikeh ben Rab Shimon le-Rabbanan. What is the difference? What is the explanation of the argument between Rab Shimon and the Rabbanan? Or essentially the Gemara is really asking, what's the reason for the Rabbanan? Why would there be a problem if there's a date on the get for the day that it was actually written? If the husband only has the rights to the fruits of his wife's property until the time when the get was written, so who cares if it was signed on a later date? The main thing is the writing of the get. Says the Gemara, no, this itself is actually the argument here. Peiri, the mishas ksive, v'at shas chsime ikbenayu. Those fruits, that income that comes from the properties of his wife, from the time when the get was written until when the get was actually signed, that's what they're arguing about. Rab Shimon holds, like we said before, that only until a person writes a get for his wife does he have rights to the fruits of his wife's property. The moment he writes a get, he loses those rights. But the Rabbanan say, no, the husband has the rights for the fruits of his wife's property until when the get is signed. So therefore, you have to have the date for when the get is signed. You can't have, if the date was earlier, so then it's not the right date for the get. That's what they're arguing about. Then again, to up until what point the husband has the rights of the fruits of his property, of the property of his wife. Okay, but now it comes out, based on what the Gemara said before the Gemara said that Rabbi Yochanan did not want to learn like Rish Lakish, because Rabbi Yochanan held that actually the husband has the rights to the fruits of his wife's property even further, till the time that he actually gives the get. Not only the writing, not the signing, but until he gives the get. So the date on the get is irrelevant. But frek the Gemara, we have a clear statement where it says the opposite in the opinions of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. The Itmar, we learned in another place as follows. From what point forward do we take away that income that the husband took from his wife? Rabbi Yochanan says, from when the get is written, he loses the rights of the income of his wife's property. But Rish Lakish says mishas nesina, from the time when when the get is given to his wife. The exact opposite that we said over here. Over here, Rish Lakish is the one that says that it goes by the time of the writing or the signing of the get. And Rabbi Yochanan is the one that it says that it goes by when you give the get to her. Says the Gemara Eipach, you're right, you're going to have to switch around the names over here in this statement that we just brought here now, has to switch around to fit with what we said before. Amalei Abayel Rav Yosef. Again.
The date doesn't help anything.
According to Rabbi Yochanan, for this purpose of knowing till when he has the rights to the fruits, the date is useless, correct?
So it's from the time of the giving or the time of the...
That's the argument here. That's the argument of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, yeah. Amalei Abayel Rav Yosef. Now Abai asks Rav Yosef another question on this whole thing here. Gimel Gittin Psulim. So there's a Mishnah later in the Masechta, this was quoted earlier as well, that there are 3 Gittin that midrabanan are puzzle, but ve'im nisis, if the get was written and it was used, and she went and got married to someone else, havlat kosher. So the get is kosher, and the child born will be kosher, the child won't be a mamsa. She's not an eshes ish. And one of them that's listed in that Mishnah is a get without a date. B'di'evet, that get is kosher. So he asked him, if so, ma'il chacham b'takanasam. What did Chachamim accomplish with their takana? Chachamim wanted that you should have a date and a get, so this husband should not have the ability to cover up for his wife that she was single at the time when she was mizana. But the thing is, though, b'di'evet, such a get is kosher. So b'di'evet, a get could be written without a date, and then he'll pull out this get and say, look, she was single at that time. And says, so Rav Yosef answered him, ahanu, what it helps is, l'chatchila lo tinase. L'chatchila, you can't write such a get. And l'chatchila, you can't get married with such a get that has no date on it. So Rashi says what the Gemara means to answer is that therefore a bezdin won't write such a get. A sefer is usually the one that a person doesn't write a get himself. A sefer writes a get. He's not going to write a get without a date. Adam won't sign a get without a date. So therefore l'chatchila, no get like this will be written. So he won't be able to use such a kind of a get to cover up for his wife. But the Gemara asks, isn't there a concern something else could happen? Gazeh lizman didei. So a husband will have the get written up properly with a date, but then he'll cut off that line that has the date on it. He'll cut it out. V'yavin ella. And he'll give her the get without the date, and then he'll still use it to cover up for her without the date.
When cutting it off the date.
He'll cut off the date. So what's going to happen in such a situation? Can't the husband still cover up for his wife, giving her a get without a date? Amalei, so Rav Yosef answered him, L'ramai loy chashinan. For this kind of a ramai, how do I translate ramai?
Shameless deceiver.
A shameless deceiver. Okay, so for a deceiver to do this, we're not concerned for this. So Rashi explains because this is a pretty detectable thing. You can see that something was cut out over here. A person is going to be afraid to do such a thing, and he'll be detected as a ramai. So therefore, we're not concerned with this. The Gemara says asks now another shaila. So we spoke about the fact that a get has to have a date, but we didn't specify what date exactly does it have to have. Now, kosav boy shavua. How about you write a date which is a very broad date, not a very specific date at all? Shavua means the date, which group of 7 years of Shemitah are we in? Every group of 7 years is divided as 7 years, another 7 years. So you write which Shemitah, which group of 7 years of Shemitah this get was written in. That's the time, that's the date of the get. Or Chaydish, you write, Shana I missed, right? You write which year the get was written in. Or Chaydish, you write the date of what month the get was written in. Or Shabbos, you write the week that it was written in, but you don't write the exact date. So what would be the halacha then? Is such a date acceptable? Amalei, so Rav Yosef said, yes, kosher. Even a get with such a kind of date will still be kosher. But the question is, if so, ma ha'ilu chachamim etakanosam. So what did chachamim accomplish with their takana to write a get with such a kind of a date? So you answered him, well, it does have still some benefit. Ahanu, what it helps is l'shavua de kamei. That if, for example, even if you're writing a get only for this 7 years of Shemitah is when it was written, so you know that it wasn't written in the previous 7 years of Shemitah. So if she was mezana in previous 7 years of Shemitah, and you're trying to cover up for her for that, so with such a get that has a later date of the next 7 years of Shemitah, you can't cover up for her. So it helps at least for that. Or according to the reason of Rish Lakish, that the husband is trying to use the fruits of his wife's property going later, but it will help that we know that he didn't divorce her, he didn't write this get at a later, the next 7 years. So at least it helps for that. And then he says to him as follows. You may ask, so writing such a broad date, it doesn't really help fully, it only helps partially. So he says, well, even if you write the actual day of the get, it can't help fully. If you're not going to follow this reasoning, when you do write the actual day of the get, the actual date itself, what day it is. Miya dinon, will you know imitzafre imipanya, whether it was written in the morning or in the afternoon? So it's still possible within the same 12-hour period of a day, or even the 24-hour period of a day, the night and the day. So it's possible that she was mizana earlier on in the day, and the get was written later on in the day, and he's covering up for what she did earlier on. Or it's possible that he's using the income of properties from later on in the day. So it's still possible to play around. Ella liyayme de kamei, but the date does help that we know that it wasn't written the day before, uliyayme de basrei, and we know that it wasn't written the following day after. So hachanami, so too ahani l'shvua de kamei, with this get is beneficial that we know that it wasn't written the period of 7 years before, or l'shvua de basrei, and it wasn't written the period of 7 years after. That's the answer to the Gemara, but it's pretty hard to understand what the Gemara is saying here because the husband could play around with this. I mean, if he finds out his wife was mizana, so he'll just write a get with a date, with a very broad date like this, and he'll be able to save her. The Mefarshim will deal with this question, but that's the title of the Gemara here.